Now, as I said in the Firestorm video, this is more of an archetype rather than a specific spell build. You can play quite a few different things with this archetype. In previous leagues, there were people that played things like Armageddon Brand. This league, I started out with Firestorm, and now with the bug fix that happened to Blazing Salvo, I have moved on to Blazing Salvo. The vast majority of the gear is exactly the same, and with the addition of a Nemus ring, we can increase our DPS quite substantially. And with a switch of a Watcher's Eye, we are able to massively increase the amount of life gain per second that this build gets due to the insane amount of projectiles that are hitting at any given time. Now, if you didn't watch my previous video as to why Blazing Salvo is significantly better than it was a few weeks ago, to give you the TLDR, essentially they fixed a bug that made it so that a splitting and returning projectile from Blazing Salvo no longer flies off into the distance and now acts as you would expect it to. What this equates to is at most about like 5 to 10 additional projectile hits every single time you cast. Other than that, I've made some small refinements to the build now that we're doing an amount of DPS that I feel is okay enough to be able to drop a little bit. We have gone ahead and become stun immune, but most everything else is about the same. We've changed up a couple different gems. I have moved to a different movement ability, although you do not have to do the same, but we'll talk about all of that and more in this video. Now, if you're new to the channel, make sure that you subscribe, and without further ado, let's get into it. Alright boys, so Blazing Salvo. This is the same character that I had before. I've made some minor changes to the character in and of itself. However, the basis of how this ability works in comparison to Firestorm is that now, instead of having one big hit that we're doing before, we have tons and tons of little hits. Now, the whole idea behind Blazing Salvo is that these projectiles shoot out, and thanks to the Nemus ring, they kind of shoot out in random directions. You'll notice that as I cast, they go in essentially every single direction, but then they all return and overlap on top of my character. Now, if you take this character and you aim very close, you'll notice that the vast majority of these are overlapping all in one spot. And as you move it out further and further, it will clear more and more and more of the screen. So the idea here is that with the addition of the Nemus ring, which is a pretty sizable difference in price when it comes to this build, we are able to go from a build that is quite mediocre at clearing to a build like Blazing Salvo, which can actually have some pretty substantial clear, especially in lower difficulty maps. Now, I've taken this build through pretty much every single bit of content in the game. I've done 80% Delirious maps, farmed those perfectly fine. I did Wave 30 Simulacrums perfectly fine. I personally have been farming Feared recently, and I've made anywhere from probably like 30 to 40 divine. I've kind of like tossed it back and forth. If the rest of this sells, it'll probably be 50 divine, and that has been pretty simple. Now, one thing that I've noticed that a lot of people have gotten wrong about the build is that I know I do say that it is able to face tank Ubers, and that is true. However, you shouldn't be doing what I do in most of the clips and like willfully going out of your way to get hit by things. Most of the times when you make a build in softcore, you make it so that it will survive most of the time, not all of the time. Because the difference between surviving 95% of the time and surviving 100% of the time is generally quite significant. Like this build, most of the time can survive things like Edziri Flame Blasts and Shaper Slam and things like that. However, if I wanted to make it survive 100% of the time, I would need to get something like 100% spell suppression or such, which is a huge amount of investment, and you would lose a lot of the effectiveness of the build. On something like hardcore, that makes sense because you cannot die. However, in softcore, where you're mainly focused on going faster and moving quickly through things, you kind of give up just a little bit of that survivability if it seems too much to invest and you lose too much damage. Now let's talk about movement, because that is one major thing that I have changed about the build. This was a suggestion from Edvin, a mod on my Discord. He was saying, hey, why don't you just try Lightning Warp? And I have to say that for an experienced player, I think Lightning Warp is actually quite good. However, I do have one major gripe with Lightning Warp in comparison to using something like Frost Blink and Shield Charge, and that is that any time that you are slowed, Lightning Warp is significantly slower. If we take a look at Lightning Warp, you'll see it says waits for a duration before teleporting to a targeted destination, with the duration based on the distance and your movement speed. So the idea here is that if you are doing something like the Feared, Maven has these like little tendrils that can connect to your character and slow you down, and when that happens, the duration of this movement is significantly longer, if I don't get stuck on Helena there. But the duration of this movement ends up being significantly longer. Now, I personally have this linked with Lightning Warp, Swift Affliction, and less duration support, which is plenty for normal movement, and for getting around, it's honestly quite good. Much better than Shield Charge, faster attacks, and Frost Blink. However, Frostblink is a true, genuine instant movement ability, meaning you can use it while you're casting. So what I would say is that if you're not a super experienced player, stick with Frostblink as well as shield charge and faster attacks, and if you kind of know what you're doing and feel a little bit more comfortable, you can move to something like Lightning Warp to get a little bit more speed. However, I really gotta say that I do miss the instant Frostblink, like just to, you know, like do little micro movements on Ubers and stuff to be able to dodge stuff. However, let's move on. I don't want to go too in depth on this video because my previous video did cover most of the like nuance of this build and it hasn't changed significantly. However, there are a couple differences and a couple things I want to go over. When it comes to skills, I'll go through them quickly. We do use our Enduring Cry on our left click. This is because we do have this node down here at the bottom left, which is going to make it so that it will be instant. An easy way to generate endurance charges, an easy way to just fill up our life bar if needed. We are using Sniper's Mark, and this is one of the big things that makes Blazing Salvo worthwhile these days. Essentially, Sniper's Mark is what got fixed for Blazing Salvo. So now, if you read this, it says projectiles which hit cursed enemies split towards 5 additional targets. Previously, those projectiles would split and then they would hit, but when they tried to return to you, they'd kind of fly off into the distance. Now we get an additional 5 hits per every single cast, and since we are using Spell Echo, we are getting 10 additional hits essentially. Most of the time. We'll talk about that in a moment. We've got Blazing Salvo. It is just a bunch of overlapping projectiles. It does a bunch of damage, can do good single target, can do good clear, all depending on how close your mouse is to your character. We have Stormbrand. This is providing us a source of shock. We are using anomalous overcharge support, and because we have such an insane amount of just generic scaling and crit, we can get up to like 18-20% shock on bosses a lot of the time, and this number goes higher the more that you invest into the build. Beyond that, it does have Culling Strike as well as our source of power charge on crit. Now, I did manage to get a Righteous Fire, a Vol Divergent Righteous Fire. I was trying to go for 21 Divergent Righteous Fire, but I got Vol. Honestly, I haven't seen a ton of use for Vol Righteous Fire. It's killed me quite a few times, if I'm going to be real with you. However, on a boss where you're like setting up for it, Cortex is a good example for this. This can be a pretty significant boost to damage if you prep it properly. Just understand this button can kill you very often. We also do have a Lightning Warp. Now, as I said, I kind of already talked specifically about Lightning Warp, but it is the new movement skill that I am personally using. And then Frost Shield. Let's really talk about Frost Shield here because I feel like a lot of people are getting this wrong. Frost Shield is insanely important to your defenses, especially when you're on Ubers. If you are looking to be able to face tank and mostly ignore abilities from Ubers, you really need to get in the habit of standing inside of your Frost Shield. Now, we are using Divergent Frost Shield if I can find it here. This makes it a little bit better if enemies are standing inside of it. You can get like Enhance and other things to make it so that it's the same as enemies standing outside of it, but it is very, very important for your tankiness that you stand inside of this Frost Shield and you get used to casting this pretty much constantly. Frost Shield is going to kind of suck your energy shield out and gain stages. That's those noises you're hearing, like the little 1, 2, 3, 4. That is it like progressing in stages and taking some of your energy shield away to give you a significantly higher effective health pool. And beyond that, we have Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire is a shoe-in, very easy to sustain on this build. We have a ton of regen, a bunch of other things. We've got a bunch of auras. We've got Vitality, Petrified Blood, Tempest Shield, and Zealotry. All pretty straightforward. If you're more interested in any of the skills or any of the nuance of the build, check the previous video. Now, talking about the gear, I am mainly going to focus on the differences between what I was doing in Firestorm and what I'm doing now in Blazing Salvo. One of the main differences, of course, is Nemus. This is pretty important as it is our source of returning projectiles. You can use returning projectile support in the main link, but it is a huge damage down. However, at this point, I do think that a returning projectile support instead of increased crit damage might be better still than Firestorm now. That is specifically with the buff that has happened to Sniper's Mark, or rather the bug fix to Blazing Salvo. So if you do and are able to get a +2 projectiles Infernal Mantle, it is quite a boost in damage. That is really the only changes. I'm not using a +3 amulet anymore. I have no reason to. It's honestly not that good, as I've said many times. And the rest of my gear is pretty much exactly the same. I did recraft my gloves because I needed a little bit more strength and dexterity. But beyond that, most nothing else has changed. One big thing that has changed is that I am using a different Watcher's Eye now. So I'm using a gain life per enemy hit while affected by vitality and increased critical strike chance. Ideally, you would want to be using the one that either gives you like cast speed or increased damage taken. However, my personal character was missing a little bit of crit chance, so I went with this. And you might also notice that I am no longer taking the explosive impact wheel, and I'm no longer going for the increased damage with hits against ignited enemies. It just seemed too annoying to be able to properly utilize, and going up here and grabbing another jewel slot, as well as grabbing this overcharge node here, just kind of seemed better. Now beyond that, the other differences with the skill tree is that we are pathing down to Unwavering Stance now. Since I do so much more damage now, it just kind of made sense to path down here to Unwavering Stance. Probably should have done this in the first place, but it wasn't like a super big deal. However, when it comes to like farming simulacrums, which this build is actually pretty good at now, and like farming 80% delirious maps and such, being stun immune is way more important, so I did go ahead and grab this, and it brought us pretty close to another jewel slot. It also gave us a few more strength tattoos, so we are able to drop Enlighten from our link, gaining us a link. Now, I know a lot of people did struggle with getting a proper militant faith, and there's honestly not a ton that I can really do about that. You guys absolutely dumpstered the market, even ones where you're going for dynamo. In the new POB, I don't include elemental resistances or anything on this militant faith anymore, so hopefully you should be able to get one. But as stated before, beyond that, nothing much else has changed. There is a new version of the POB that does use inspired learning, but we're going to need to go jump into Path of Building so I can show you that. Now, notably with the POBs, there are two separate ones. There is a min-max POB, which is quite a bit more money, but also quite a bit more powerful. I'll talk about that in a moment. Let's talk about the base one. When it comes to changes, there isn't a lot that has changed here realistically. I already kind of talked about the tree and the differences that happen. There is going to be an inspired learning tree here though. So it is relatively straightforward to get inspired learning working on this build. You're just going to drop a couple points in a few places, like a little bit of regen here. You'll drop a little bit of block, and you're able to get in an inspired learning relatively easily. One thing to note is that you do have to be careful with inspired learning in general on this build, because if you get like Soul Eater or a bunch of cast speed, you can very quickly bring yourself to 1 HP, because we sacrifice 10% of our life every time we cast, so do be careful about that. However, this farming setup was super comfortable. You can move quite quickly through maps. It is kind of fun to play, and it was a lot tankier than something like the Lightning Arrow Deadeye that I played earlier. It doesn't have as much like clear potential, but single target is significantly higher, and you can kill those like Legion bosses and Omniphobia and Kosis and all that kind of stuff way easier with this build. But going back to the normal in-game tree, I'm talking about the skills. Nothing much has changed here. I am still using Shield Charge and Faster Attacks and Frostblink in the actual POB. If you want to use Lightning Warp, fit it in yourself. You can look at my character and my profile if you like. I think the vast majority of people should probably still play Frostblink though. It is just going to be a little bit safer. When it comes to the items, not much has changed. As I said before, we are using the Nemus, and a few pieces of gear have been recrafted, but they use the same basis as before. A couple additional jewels. You can fit in a Corrupting Blood Jewel if you really want to instead of one of these. It didn't seem like a huge deal for my character. Configuration hasn't changed massively, however, there is one thing that I want to go over. If you notice down here, it says gain 500 life per enemy hit with spells. The idea here is that with the way that I had to set up Blazing Salvo to get semi-accurate damage, I had to set it to 1 projectile and then have the full DPS show roughly, I think it's 28 projectiles. Now, full disclosure here, if you want to have accurate DPS, unless you are standing in like the exact perfect location and things are going well, you're probably not going to be able to hit 28 projectiles. Even though we have this many, I don't actually think this many are hitting the boss every single time. I set it to this because this is the amount of projectiles that you are shooting out, and for consistency, I do want to leave it here. However, I would say on average, you're probably hitting 20 to 24 on most normal size bosses. Larger bosses or larger enemies like Kosis and Omniphobia and stuff like that, you probably will be hitting like 26 to 28. However, do keep in mind, DPS is slightly inflated because of this. So with this in mind, I do have it set here though to about 20 hits per cast. This is how much life gain that you're probably going to get on average. You're hitting about 20 times, and it is going to be 25 life gain from the Vitality Watcher's Eye. You could do the math yourself if you want a more accurate number, if you get like a 30 life Vitality Watcher's Eye, but it should be relatively accurate and giving us an additional additional like 2800 on hit because we are casting extremely quickly. Now beyond that, I have updated the notes as always. These notes should be up to date for anything that has changed about the build. I did do some slight changes to the gear crafting. It's nothing super major, but some of the pieces of gear had to be changed a little bit. But beyond that, everything else in here is mostly the same, just added in a couple of extra things that might be needed. Now that's pretty much it for the POB. Let's quickly talk about the min-max POB. So there are a few changes here, okay? Most of the changes, you might notice that we're doing like 60 or 70 million more DPS, and we have quite a bit more life. Most of this comes down to the fact that we just have better crafted gear. It's just you're being a little bit more particular with the gear that you're trying to go for. And then on top of that, we are going to be using a +2/+2 Infernal Mantle, and because we're using the +2/+2 Infernal Mantle, we can use the crafted one, which is significantly better as long as we've got those gem levels. Other than that, the tree has changed relatively decently. One big change is that we are using a keystone tattoo for Unwavering Stance. This makes it so that we don't need to get any of this down here, and we are taking those points and putting them into an Unnatural Instinct over here. This gets us a bunch of AoE, which helps us overlap and clear a little bit better. It gets us a bunch of cast speed, a bunch of life recovery, and all that kind of good stuff. Just a pretty decent Unnatural Instinct in general. Beyond that, nothing really has changed besides this being a level 100 tree and this being in here and using obviously better gems and such. This is a min-max POB. We're going to be using like Awakened Spell Echo and all of the alt quality everything in here, so expect that. In the notes, I did try to update most of the crafts to tell you how to get these higher tier items, like how to do the slightly more strict crafts, I guess you could call them. And I went through and, redid everything for the min-max POB. And that's going to be it for the video. Hopefully you try out the new version of the build if you haven't already quit for the league. This is most likely going to be my last build guide video for the league. I've got like a couple more ideas bouncing around in my brain, but we're really getting towards the end of the league and I kind of need a break for at least a week or two before we start testing. So I hope you guys have had a good league. Tattoos have honestly been pretty amazing, even if I didn't really like the league mechanic too much at all. If you do have questions about anything, as always on my Discord, there is a dedicated thread, which I do try to answer questions in whenever I can. If you're interested in getting help with any particular version of the build, just try to keep it to that thread if you can help it. Don't pollute the rest of the channels with a bunch of questions, because people like just talking about Path of Exile and stuff in general in there. And remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Rayclast. And I'll see you guys in the next video.